Morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Nice, Bill. Exchange must be over.
I think I need to be walled in by LCD panels. There's so much stuff that's open
Yeah, right.
now.
How about steel bars?
Oh, no, I don't need that. But Bill, nice job this morning.
Oh, you think so? I didn't mess up too much for
No,
No, I mean, I thought it was good, good back and forth, and I think you know, good callers. I'm sorry the program seemed like it was really short because of you know, other things that the fundraising that they were doing, but
well, you know, Dave, you've said it. This particular enterprise, public schools, and how to finance them, is really one of the most complex endeavors that the public sector undertakes, and it is very hard for an hour show to get to the core of what you've said on this commission. Is what is the problem we're trying to solve, and I think it's also, honestly, it's extremely hard for a normal court proceeding, a judicial branch proceeding. The right place is, as the court has said many times, in the legislative branch, which has the ability to deep dive and examine. And then that's what you all on this commission, me too, have been trying to do, is really get into the underlying fabric of this very complex system. And certainly there's no press article and no hour show. I really adore Laura Knoy in that show. It's such a great news show in today's world, where you don't often have, you know, just kind of like a non-reality type of a real news show. And so she did a great job, but it's awful hard.
mm-hmm.
but
Yeah,
I think you did cover in that short period of time the essence of what we're doing here. And I think, Bill, your comments were right on point, trying to, particularly when you started talking about input and output. I mean, that was a whole new concept, I think, to folks who haven't, for the first time, have heard those two concepts coming together, which I thought you did a very nice job in positioning those.
I take it that you guys are talking about a show that occurred this morning.
Yeah, it was on.
Who are not in on this.
Well,
so school funding was the subject of the exchange with Laura Knoy this morning.
I see.
And
you can listen to it, because it'll be on again tonight at 8 o'clock on NPR.
Well, you can stream it right now.
But you can also stream it anytime.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank
you.
But Bill was on it along with Liz Canada, and I didn't. Natalie, who was from Berlin and was on the amicus brief, and she actually came and testified in House Education this past spring.
And then the superintendent, I think, Julie
Yeah.
King from Berlin.
Yeah. So, and there were some good, so, you know, a handful of callers that came in that expressed, you know, different comments and positions on things. So it was good. I think there was you know, a good airing, but I agree with Bill, very short period of time. And, you know, we've got 6 hours ahead of us today. And, and even that will be hard pressed to, I mean, it takes a lot to accomplish things in this area and really understand them. So, hey, so we're a little bit past past our start time. Let me just pull up a couple of things. So thanks for signing up again for another long Tuesday of work groups. And I see we've got a handful of people that are joining us as attendees as well. So my thanks go out to them also. And we'll just get this this thing started here. Let me just take a quick look. I don't think we're missing anybody. I think we're in good shape. So so we'll call to order the Fiscal Policy Work Group of the Commission to Study School Funding. Today's September 29th, 2020, a little after 10 o'clock in the morning. And I guess in accordance with the governor's emergency order, we'll get things started with a roll call. So I'll begin. Dave Luno here in Hopkinton with Ozzy the long-haired dachshund roaming around. And let's see, we've also got John Beardmore.
Morning, John Beardmore, also in Hopkinton.
And Mary Heath.
Mary Heath here in Manchester, and my husband's in the other room.
All righty, and Chris Dwyer.
Chris Dwyer, today I'm up in Pittsburgh.
Ooh, fantastic. And Dick Ames.
Here in Jaffrey in my home, alone in my office.
And Rick Ladd.
Rick Ladd's here in Haverhill, New Hampshire, with 2 homeschooling kids and my wife.
Great, thanks, Rick. And we've got Mel Myler.
Mel Myler from calling from Port Clyde, Maine.
And we've got Bill Ardinger.
Bill Ardinger from Concord, New Hampshire, my office. No, I'm here alone, but I'm also jealous that Chris is probably up there for the end of trout season, which is awesome.
The color this year is like nothing I've ever seen. Going up through Franconia Notch. It's already, by Second Connecticut Lake, it's already passed though. So you got to hurry and see it.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah, no, wonderful. And we've got our Carsey team. We've got Carrie Portree.
Hi, Carrie Portree, Dover, New Hampshire. I'm in my apartment alone.
Great, thanks, Karen. Jordan Hensley.
Jordan Hensley, also in Dover. My fiance is here as well.
Okay, and Bruce Mallory.
Calling in from Kittery Point, Maine this morning from my home office. I'm here by myself.
Great, fantastic. Let's see. I think today what we'd really plan to do is sort of you know, taking a look at the agenda, taking a look at the AIR presentation, and really sort of understanding how some of the considerations that come out of that reflect on our work on fiscal policy. And then I think really the large part of this morning's effort is going to consider the Londonderry decision and how that relates to the concept of New Hampshire's obligation for a first and last dollar funding of the cost of adequacy, or if there are other interpretations, and how the commission may want to be moving forward, possibly with considerations that look at both you know, potential you know, factors for first last dollar or other you know, funding type method. So and in fact, a lot of that was discussed on change this morning too. So So I think that'll be an interesting and important discussion for us to have and for us to bring forward to the full commission. And I think in conjunction with that, and probably closely related to it is this idea of what the state's obligation is for providing an opportunity for an adequate education, or perhaps in our model, access to equitable outcomes. And and how that, is that something that that we feel strongly about as a commission, or is it something that well, depends on where you live? And I think that's sort of a foundational question too. So with that, I know Jordan sort of pointed out to a few pages in the AIR report, and I don't know if you want to sort of bring us to that, Jordan, and we can sort of kick off our conversation this morning.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So really the question here is just when we look at the AIR report, and I will pull it up here. If I can find it. I also have many screens up. Okay. So when we look at the AIR report, and their modeling of both a revenue model that is entirely funded by a statewide property tax, or a statewide property tax that also includes a minimum local mandatory contribution. To what extent does fiscal policy agree or disagree with that as a policy choice? And then to what extent does fiscal policy believe that this is something that conforms with with constitutional obligations? And I think that's at the core of the discussion that we're proposing to have today. Does first and last dollar, if the commission decides to define adequacy as a certain outcome standard, and they are obligated to pay for the whole thing, obviously that raises different policy considerations than if they're not.
Right. And go ahead, Jordan. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that also, the model that AIR has proposed is pretty simplistic. I think it's a jumping off point. You could consider from a policy standpoint the conversations we've had about circuit breakers, different considerations for folks on fixed incomes, things like that. None of that is captured in what AIR has done. They've kind of sketched out a broad outline. Obviously, this group has a lot of considerations within that, trying to make things more equitable for taxpayers. So, really just looking at this as kind of a jumping off point.
Right. So thanks, Jordan, for I think a good setup on that. And I guess I want to sort of just quickly sort of triage the AIR report into two pieces. The estimated cost model, which is based on their drill down into 10 years of DOE 25s and coming up with estimated costs based on equitable outcomes, normalized across the state, and that was a ton of work, a ton of research that they provided. The back end of their final report is really a couple of revenue scenarios that they lay out, and I agree with Jordan's analysis. They're pretty simple and straightforward. It's really doesn't really cut to the heart of the work that AIR did. AIR's real work was in the heart of the work was in the how do you go about defining or determining what it costs to have more student equity, and per a lot of our conversations, discussions, we moved from input-based to outcome-based, and all of that analysis. So I'm sort of putting that part off to the side, because that's a big part of what AIR did. But taking a look at how they went about modeling, how school districts could pay for this, and both, I think, examples, and I'm really calling these examples because they're not really recommendations, and even the exhibits call them examples. I think are based on the first last dollar first last dollar model that currently is used in the state. So with that, I guess just sort of want to open it up to some discussion. I think I saw some movement from Chris.
Right. I have what might seem like a radical suggestion, to actually take what you just said and make it reorganize the report so that that point is clearer. You know, being from obviously a former donor town, having had the experience on Friday of doing a presentation to, at their request, our city councilors about this. This report is already widely misunderstood all around the state. And I think we risk the important modeling work being dismissed, as I heard one of our counselors, who is also a school administrator in a different district, already say, we can kill this. We risk all that work being dismissed if people think that this second part is our committee's proposed recommendation. And I would think that the second part could be treated as an appendix example. I mean, I think it's very good, but I think we risk having folks not pay attention to all of that modeling work that really answers the question, sets up the problem, if people too quickly assume that this is the proposed, as even I've been contacted by legislators from other communities who've listened to our meetings and who have immediately assumed that this report is the proposal, and they go to that last chapter and are concerned about it. So we need to actively make sure that we're still holding we're holding a dialogue here, and we're not shutting it down. And so one thought is that we treat that final chapter in a different way. It could be to me, I would keep it with the report and maybe have it be an appendix, an if scenarios, just as you said, Dave, scenarios that kind of, as Jordan was saying, broadly sort of say what this would take, but not as if it's the final concluding chapter in a report. And I think we have obviously a lot more work to do on that, but I was immediately contacted after our last commission meeting by two very smart legislators who have listened into our meetings or have streamed them, and who immediately assumed that this was the proposal. So I think we need to make sure that we're not, as we start to go about the next phase of our work, that we don't have everybody out there thinking it's already concluded.
Yeah, Chris, I appreciate that a lot, and I absolutely agree with everything you just said. One of the things that's been a little frustrating for me when people whether they're media outlets and they're asking for a little bit of input or comment on it, and they ask about this, I said, no, I mean, these aren't recommendations. These are pretty simple examples, and I think I've even used the word like sort of straw man examples based on really sort of straightforward, nothing really too complicated, and really not related, I think, to the analytical effort that AIR did in costing education. And I agree with you, Chris. I think it distracts from the meat of the effort. And as much as I like to point out that, hey, these aren't recommendations, it ultimately gets reported out. Oh, the research team is recommending this and that, and that's just absolutely not the case at all. So, other thoughts on that? I'm not. Since I got everybody on the screen, I mean, just go hand wave like that, and that makes it easier for me to see. Dick?
Sure. Well said, Chris. I think it's evident to all of us that the material that worked through how the costs that had been figured at the front end of the report might be paid for were illustrating how they might be paid for, but we're not embracing a particular way. And we need to clarify that. A letter came in, I think Jordan just sent a letter from one of the towns, a small town up north that has high property values, from their Board of Selectmen protesting this, just as you've encountered in Portsmouth and in the places around you, the same reaction and sense that we're going down that road, which we haven't decided to do at all. So clarification is important. The other point I want to make is that we've got a lot of work to do. We need to understand what these options are. And one aspect of that sort of last part of the report was use of the so-called mandatory or required minimum local contribution. That really wasn't explained. And we need to understand that's a reality just south of us in Massachusetts. And it's been fleshed out. It's a very interesting concept, much less threatening to high property value towns because it's capped. If you reach a certain point, it's sort of like our current local statewide property tax. It doesn't require an excess revenue payment out to the rest of the state from those towns that have more than enough. It's a very interesting proposal that brings to the fore this discussion that's on our agenda of the first and last dollar. And we need to, A, understand that proposal, B, look at it in terms of the legalities. I happen to think that it's a way of funding that relies on a local contribution that would probably, I'd say probably, meet approval with our court, even though it's different from what's been considered before. It's not your traditional state funding source, but it would be interesting to everybody, including those towns with high property values, to see how that would work. So we need to work that through. I look forward to working it through, and I guess that's where I'd leave it right now. I agree with you that I don't know what we do to temper the impact of the last part of the report, but maybe there's something that that can be done there, but we need to go forward too and dig into the options that to solve this problem. And way back when we got started, Bill was talking about how mind-boggling this whole effort is. And school funding is one of the most complex problems that he's encountered, that I've encountered. My brain's worn out, and we'll keep fumbling along. But I think those who are watching us need to understand that that's what we're doing. We're doing our best and not jumping to conclusions.
So I think I saw, thanks, Dick. I think I saw hands from John and Bill.
Go ahead, John.
I guess I'm a little confused and a little frustrated because we've been at this now for 9 months, plus or minus, and we're talking about, burying the headline section of our consultant report because it's distracting from the meat of what the consultant did, which I assume to be, their analysis on property and outcome equity, which they did a great job with and proved what we already knew, which is that outcomes and property taxes are not equitable in this state. But if we're gonna bury the controversial section or somehow signal that it isn't what people think it is, even though it says in the report it's not what people think it is, it's an example, not a recommendation, then what are we going to do? Time is of the essence here. So if we're going to bury this, then what is each member's proposal in the alternative? So, I'm not for burying that. I think it's a fine there I go, using the word recommendation. It's a fine example, and it's perhaps a worthy recommendation, but I guess I'm a little anxious to get going and to make some decisions and to take some votes because we've accumulated a massive amount of information. We've done a fair bit of analysis, and I think it's time for brass tacks.
No, thanks, John, for that. Go ahead, Chris, for Anna. I saw your, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal is not to bury the headline, John. I don't think the headline is a fully first and last dollar funded statewide property tax. That's not the headline that we've come to. I think the headline is about the disparities, the level of need, et cetera. And I'm concerned that headline gets buried because, this is a two-step problem. I certainly share your comments about urgency and, needing to move forward on that discussion. But, it probably depends what conversations you've been in, how you feel about this. But I think we could easily swamp the investment if we accept one example, if we allow people to treat one example of financing as if it is the one recommendation. That's my only point, and I'm just here to testify that that's how people are treating it in multiple communities, not just my community.
Yeah, and I think just having just having this conversation is an important thing to do, because it's one thing if it's Dave Luno or Bill Ardinger talking with somebody that's in the media, and there's a whole other thing when we're talking about it as a group. And I think we're in sort of general I see I think general recognition that the real findings of our research team stand without the necessarily the property tax and mandatory minimum examples that they lay out. in here. So I agree with what Chris said. I mean, the idea is not burying something, but to really, I think, focus the attention on what the research team has recommended, you know, in terms of estimated costs and student equity and their findings certainly surrounding taxpayer equity, but allowing the commission to go ahead and model, you know, funding mechanisms that are based on maybe stuff that we don't even come to full agreement on, and maybe we show it a couple different ways. I mean, you know, we may not be unanimous. We might be split on first last dollar, and we can come up with some different ways of doing this. But you know, ultimately, like we've said a lot, ultimately this is going to come down to the governor, the House, and the Senate in terms of legislation going forward. And I certainly hope they'll base that legislation on the work that we've done, and particularly something that recognizes the lack of equity in New Hampshire that you know, that there is in public education, and I think we've all, you know, talked about that and recognize that important change from maybe the, you know, what's been the status quo in New Hampshire for so long. Sorry, Bill, you're up.
So let me, I'm hearing a couple, you know, with Chris's point and John's point, and a possible gap that hasn't been addressed as a kind of like planning matter by the commission. One possible outcome of a commission like this would be a fully integrated proposal that actually produces a spreadsheet that goes town by town and signs off on particular revenue models, and it's internally consistent, and it would be almost as if the, you know, what the legislature might adopt in a bill. That is an ultimate, absolutely complete, full, you know, end of game type of output of the commission. Another output of the commission would be to recommend various principles and not go so far as to produce a fully integrated town by town spreadsheet. It seems to me, you're right, Dave. At the end of the day, just like in Massachusetts with their commission, anything we recommend is going to go through the sausage grinder process of the legislature, of the governor, of the executive branch, and it's going to be very, very, you know, hard slogging work to get to a final spreadsheet that can be encapsulated in legislation that can be enacted. A possible outcome, and I'm not saying which is right or wrong, but I think this is a gap that the leadership of the commission has to answer, is that we produce a report that says things like, the top headline outcome of the AIR report is that the ECM model recommends relationships among communities on total spending that predicts the costs that are necessary to achieve a target outcome. And that is something that the commission recommends should be incorporated in any legislation that would reform, ultimately, the current system. You could also say aspects of the current system that we don't like. The fact that 85% of our total expenditures from the state are allocated to communities on a fixed per pupil basis of $3,709, we could say, I think the commission could say, boy, that doesn't make sense. It's inconsistent with the AIR report, with targeting, and it may be that we can't get votes on these. I'm just suggesting it might be that we could recommend that with respect to the state property tax, that the fund should be collected locally, remitted to a state account, and distributed in accordance with a different formula consistent with the others. We could also recommend that there be property tax relief provisions for low net worth, low cash flow individuals. We don't, you know, the question I have, and it's an open question, are we working to produce an integrated spreadsheet that would like inform final legislation? Because boy, that's hard. And I just put that on the table. I don't know, Dave, Mel, and Jay, what we're aiming towards as an output, but I think now is the time to really talk about it in concept. And then, like John says, we got to get there fast because we're out of time.
Right, no question about that. And you know, I think from a legislative standpoint too, I mean, we're already looking at a time frame where we need to get the LBA involved, so that we can migrate a lot of this spreadsheet development over to a you know, a more available and accessible group or team, so that members of the legislature can you know, can have their own scenarios modeled and propose what they want or what they're looking to do. But you know, I think it is important to us to be able to model various approaches, and I'm sure several of us who are Excel knowledgeable have you know, have developed some things and are trying some different things, but I think in order to bring that to a discussion either here in fiscal policy first and then to the full commission, we do have to get past some I think fundamental policy considerations, and one of them is definitely, is there a responsibility, is there a response, no, let me say it another way. Should every student in New Hampshire have access to equitable outcomes? And if we're getting a lot of people nodding to that and general consensus across the commission that that's something that we feel is a strong principle, going back to Bill's point, that is a front page headline in our final report, that's going to be really important, because that's very different, obviously, than how it exists today. And with that in place, what's the commission's position on first last dollar? And I want to sort of, you know, move our discussion, you know, over to that. But I think that's going to also, you know, weigh heavily on what sort of recommendations that we make, not just on how we go about paying for public education in the state, but possibly affect the how we look at the estimated cost model, because we know that a decade ago, it did, more than a decade ago, it did affect how the estimated costs were arrived at. Rick.
Thanks. I've been listening to everybody here. I've also been contacted by a number of folks in the legislature. I'm hearing from them that we're okay with creating a formula that's trying to drive towards equitable outcomes for the opportunity for an adequate education. And so that means what we define, what has been defined as an adequate education, those are where they want to see those equitable outcomes funded. There are some other outcomes which are unique to various districts that will never be replicated in some communities based upon so many unique variables in those communities. But then I also hear that folks are really supportive of integrating this concept or this principle into how we do fund the weighting issue, the weighting of different needs. Students, some needs require more dollar per pupil. That's supported. Where there are some other questions, though, is that it's coming down to that basic ingredient. How many dollars are we going to have to spend for education? And the costing of an education that we hear based upon some of the cases like Conval is based upon that total amount for education as they've extracted from the DOE 25 forms. But there's a lot of costs within the DOE 25 form, which are above and beyond the cost of an adequate education. So they're saying, okay, can we base it on a disaggregated element, which is a portion of the total DOE 24, that disaggregated element would be the cost of an adequate education. So I think the issues I'm hearing from a lot of the folks which are coming to me is that we're looking at the costs to provide this education as really a steep price, and they don't know how we're going to sustain or even pay for that in this state. The last thing that several have mentioned to me is that perhaps there's some things that don't belong in the adequacy formula at all and need to be more aligned with categorical grants, and where that is determined by formulas outside. And that the AIR supported that, or at least mentioned it in terms of the funding of the special education catastrophic aid to transportation. I don't think we've really given that a lot of discussion or thought, but those are real expensive costs that people are getting convoluted with the adequacy formula as well, and along with the building aid, which that's a separate categorical area. So those are some of the concerns that I'm hearing. And the one spoken the most is the costing of education based upon the total sum of the DOE 25 form. Is that accurate? Are we measuring everything where people have gone way beyond an adequate education to come up with that figure we've come up with? Thanks.
So thanks, Rick. I think some of that is definitely fuel for discussion at the adequacy work group as well, and the full commission. I know there's going to be discussion at 3 o'clock today on some of those categorical grant areas, and the three that you've laid out. And I know they've had some discussion of those already too. But and I believe the AIR team had also excluded some of those things, like transportate the ECM exclude, one model of the ECM excludes transportation, so rolls that out there. And of course the special education grant in beyond 3.5 times and beyond 10 times, and I know you've got some legislation in on that. Building aid, obviously, another one too. So I guess what I want to do is sort of roll it over to the conversation on first and last dollar.
Yeah.
And because I think that's going to have a lot of weight on how we go about looking at this total cost. Probably more weight than I mean, school districts across the state have to sell their budget. Most of them do have to sell their school district budgets to the local property taxpayers, who open up the checkbook and write the big check. So for whatever it's worth, that $3.2 billion all in that's spent get you this outcome on a statewide basis. So whether or not a certain field trip is part of an adequate education or something else, you just got to look at it as an all-in number. I mean, I think that's how that's being done. But first and last dollar, I think, is going to weigh very heavily on that. So I think we should move over to that.
But
Bill.
we have the issue of discussing the constitutional. The Constitution says we provide a constitutionally adequate education. So we have to provide the costing for this. That is the portion which is the adequate education, not the total education, which is the field trips or the nice things which school districts go beyond, or the costing of labor, which goes well beyond the cost that we have within our base adequacy right now. In hiring more, the ratio goes down to, in some cases, 12-1 or 14-1, whereas it might be 25-1 or 30-1 as prescribed by rule and law. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm having questions being driven at me saying, are you funding whatever a district wants to do, or are you going to fund an adequate education? Bill, help me out.
Rick, no. And you know, when you take a look at the AIR report, what they're saying is this amount of money is being spent to get these outcomes. And every student in New Hampshire deserves the opportunity to have a nominal state average outcome. That's all that's saying. So the report is not suggesting that if you spend 70% of the $3.2 billion, that you also get those outcomes, because there's no evidence to suggest that. And we all know, having been involved in schools, either as students, as parents, that not every day in school is the exact same thing, and that it's the sum total of all those experiences that net these outcomes. Not that, you know, I'm, you know, I don't know if that's making any sense, but it's an all-in. Chris.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, you know, Rick identifies one of the reasons why we need the principles Bill is talking about and understand which principles we agree on, because a principle of defining adequacy by performance is something we have to agree on as a committee. And I think that's a really important thing. I was able to explain that to our counselors. You know, I developed some PowerPoint slides, and I do believe they accepted that. I think one of the things that helped them is that I identified that in the AIR report, you know, there are districts, there's a handful of districts where, you know, just to check on the modeling, if you want to think of it that way, that are about at that average level of performance. And you know, they're not just tiny little districts, or they're not districts that don't have high schools. And you know, but that was a theme I had to keep kind of coming through. I think it's particularly hard for the people who come at this from a special ed perspective, because they know these catastrophic extra costs, and they have other things on their mind. And so it's hard for them to kind of keep remembering that we're defining adequacy in a different way. But, you know, I developed slides that really tried to just say to our council, you know, that was one way of defining adequacy, but this all rests on your understanding that this is a different way of defining adequacy. Until we get that across, a lot of the rest of what's in there isn't going to make sense to people.
Yeah. Rick, can I speak to Rick? Rick, in listening to you talk about this, what I hear is the way that you, as an exceptional legislator, have thought about education funding, and also a town leader, and many educators like superintendents and principals think about it. They think about it on cost plus this cost plus that cost plus this cost plus that cost equals the total cost of education, budget type approach. The model that AIR has put on the table is completely different than that. No longer does it matter that you're going to tally up the cost of a teacher with masters, or the cost of a library, or the cost of technology. What AIR's report does is say, look, we want to predict the cost that it will take this district to allow its students to achieve a target outcome. As you see, it doesn't matter whether the particular district has a library or not. The focus on AIR's outcome and quality definition to adequacy is not on the components of cost. It's on predicting the total cost of allowing districts who make their own decisions to achieve a particular targeted outcome level. You might define adequacy under the old way, Rick, like in 2008, you would define adequacy as a base cost of $37.09, which is based on a kind of buildup of how you get to that cost. That's out the door under the AIR approach. You have to, after all those years of doing that great work, you're being asked in this particular commission, and as Chris said, not everyone has signed off on this yet, you're being asked to put that to the side and to accept a new way of defining adequacy, which is based on achieving outcomes. And the outcomes are not based on a cost up approach. And so that's fundamental. And that, you know, honestly, Dave, is a separate question from first and last dollar, which if we get there, I've got a graph that I think we have to tie this down to real examples, and comparing to Massachusetts, I think is the best way to point to what first and last dollar means. We know it intuitively, but we have to see it in numbers to really discuss it and get forward on an answer, I believe. So when you're ready for that, maybe Justin could loan me the screen. But I wanted to address to Rick when he said, that's what I think, and you guys all tell me if I'm wrong, that's what I'm perceiving that we have before us with AIR.
So Bill, I have a question, and thanks for explaining what you did. In fact, the two ways of providing the funding for education here, but looking at the latter, what you spoke about, the targeted outcome, how are you saying specifically our outcome is, you know, this over here, these are the outcomes we want as measured by those three in achievement, graduation rates, attendance rates? Okay, so we got those outcomes there. How are you going to have the accountability for those outcomes in terms of, so you have a district that's coming up still not achieving and not showing growth?
I think, honestly, Rick, you've just answered your own question. By adopting this index, this data-based approach to evaluating where a district is in terms of the target outcome, which AIR happened to set at the average outcome level, if you go over this year, next year, the following year, and this was a fundamental part of Lynch's plan, Governor Lynch's plan, you actually get an accountable piece of data. If, for example, you're determining that the standard deviation below the target for Claremont is pretty large, so Claremont gets more state dollars under the way the model works. If Claremont continues to underperform and not get to those target levels, I think the accountability mandate in the Constitution that the court has found would kick in. And at that point, the state government would have a greater responsibility to examine the performance and decisions of that district. So I think that that in fact your accountability is built in to the outcome. A huge failure, this is in my view, of the input cost model, a huge failure is it never, we had to adopt a regime later in the statute about performance-based analysis to try and run an accountability. This integrates our adequacy definition with accountability, which is on a year-by-year basis, you're determining how have they made any progress towards the outcome target.
So
Yeah.
Bill, then you're basically saying then to me now, because we're going for these targeted outcomes and due to the state now funding at this level for these targeted outcomes, with some coming from the local, yes, how are we going to control the instruction, the supervision, the leadership, all those variables which are beyond that of the state. Right now, statute says the responsibility for instruction and curriculum is that of the local. So if we're going to be going the way you're going towards is having these targeted outcomes, which are established based upon these 3 criteria we mentioned earlier, then we're going to have to change a whole bunch of statutory language. We're going to have conflicts because we won't have control or the ability to have accountability.
So Rick, I think it's what you just said, it's worth pointing out too. I mean, obviously, local school districts are led by a superintendent, building principals, master teachers, curriculum coordinators, and others. But you can see a very direct relationship between the average cost per student and the outcome. So that's where the correlation lies. It's not whether Corrine Cascadon is the superintendent, and then you get these outcomes, and David Ryan's the superintendent, and you get these other outcomes. And so I obviously, I think a lot of us have probably been on school boards. I know how hard our school administrators and our teaching faculty work, and how much care they put into what they do for our students. And I'm not suggesting we take away, that level of, organization and administration of things. And I do agree with what Bill just suggested, that this sort of integrated accountability exists with that. I think it's much more straightforward. In fact, it's measured every year by the department. Whether it's the best combination of factors to look at for performance, I don't know. It's what we've got right now from the department, and I think one of the things that's come up frequently in all of our work groups is the idea that we may want to recommend additional data collection on from the department, and possibly have another data review 5 years out or 10 years out. I mean, certainly, Bill, you've suggested it should at least be done every 10 years to recalibrate, because that's what was done right now with the teardown of the DOE 25s, the evaluation of 10 years of DOE 25s, the evaluation of the outcomes, determined the estimated costs, and then that would continue using a weighted model, and based on what was determined during this study. Obviously, that ends up being open loop if you let it go too long, and would need to be reevaluated. But now's the time to make sure that we're providing the DOE with the guidance they need to collect the data that we think could even be more relevant down the road. Dick, I saw your hand up earlier. Chris, I don't know if you had something direct to this point, or Dick, is that all right if Chris, then you? All right.
Well, I think that this model sets.
No, Chris, you just muted.
I think this model sets the table for accountability, but I think Rick is right in that the accountability mechanisms aren't there in our state in the same way that they are in some other states. What you see states doing repeatedly is letting people fail a lot, and that it's the accumulation of failure that then triggers support. I would hope that we could get ahead of that and realize that you can't take a low performing district. Even districts that have high needs are low performing for a reason. And you can't take a low performing district, give it a lot of money, and expect that you're going to get results. You need to pair that with a kind of support that points the way. So I would hope, now that's outside our role here, I know, but I would hope we could think of accountability in a more positive, progressive way than letting it be after this many years of failure, then this happens. And then when you really fail, then this happens. And then when it's really terrible, this happens, which is kind of the typical model in these things. So I do think we have to have some ancillary, the legislature is going to have to work on some ancillary expectations from the Department of Ed. Hopefully it doesn't change everything. It comes in the form of support and direction, review of plans, et cetera, as opposed to, telling everybody how to do everything.
Right. Thanks, Chris. Dick, thanks.
Sure. So I'm getting back, this isn't on accountability, this is back to the adequacy discussion that preceded this. Rick started it, I think. The AIR model works off of a average outcome level and develops numbers based on that, as I understand it. And it shows the average performance level as a plausible choice from the point of view of AIR because New Hampshire's high standing in the region and in the country on the performance on average of its education system. And so that's what it worked off of. And the consequence, as we all know, is a cost, a set of costs that add up to close to $3 billion, about what the state spends in total right now. And so I want to raise the question of, goes to Rick's concern about what is adequacy, of whether that method used by and standard used by AIR translates to constitutional adequacy. And we're going to need to get there at some point. Maybe we don't do it now. Maybe this is Jay's on Jay's plate with the adequacy committee. It's a little hard for a fiscal resource to go forward very far without knowing what that number is. If it's $3 billion, that's one thing. If it's $2 billion, that's quite a different thing. And I'd like to see some conversation about that.
Jay, you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I want to make sure I understand Dick. That Dick, you're questioning the 2.947 figure. Is that?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Let's just say that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think all of us are feeling. I mean, I don't know. I hope all of us are feeling we can't question that figure. I mean, the model has accepted that our current spending is getting us to these average outcomes, which are adequate for us, and our distribution is what's causing the great variation from that average.
If I may respond, you might conceptualize this as two different things. One is a leadership level of funding. Let's call it a leadership level of funding, or a best quality level that we want to aspire to. We want every district in the state to be at least that average level, which of course means, and I asked this question in the earlier discussion of AIR, means that our state average will go up because many districts will go above the average. If we bring everybody up to the average, then the average goes up. So that average, however, is what we will require. No, not require, but what we aspire to. We could treat it that way, and we want everybody to go there, but we're not going to require that. What we're going to require is something less than that, that we conclude is sufficient. One of the justices in this parade of court cases over the years, in a concurring opinion, in the Londonderry case that that's in background right here for today, said that he wrote, a constitutionally adequate public education gives our children a safety net, a guarantee that at a minimum they will receive a state-funded constitutionally adequate education. And the implication there is that it's not the best. Members of this commission have sort of reacted to the word adequate because it's really not what we aspire to, but it's a minimum. And so if you go down that road, then that leads you to a number lower than the number that multiplies out to $3 billion. So I'm asking, that how others feel about this, and maybe the feeling is, well, how can we go below that average? We can't, so we're going to require everybody to come up to that average. Or maybe the feeling is, no, that's not what we're going to mandate, but it's what we aspire to, something like that.
Well, I think we are expecting a target. We are setting a target at these average outcomes, and you've stated before that it's likely the average or the total spending will go up, and that's going to be a local district option. But at least for our distribution of funds raised by the state and distributed by the state will be to achieve that average outcome. We've priced it. I mean, they've said with the amount of money that we're currently spending, we can achieve those average outcomes in every district, at least to get the opportunity for those average outcomes. And so I think that price is known. And if we start to question that or start to take it apart, that there's something that's not the true cost, well, we're just going to cascade down the hill and not be able to establish any particular funding principles. So I think, and I don't think that they've picked a wild number either. I think that by choosing a current spending figure, it is possible to arrive at the conclusions that they have. I guess while I'm saying something here that seems to respond to Dick, I think, Dave, and some of the others who've asked the question about, so how does this report finalize? What are we trying to suggest for legislation in this coming session? I think we have what is a Weberian option. And that's that we've got multiple ideal types. One is we've got to work with this first and last dollar model. And what would it take to do it at $2.947 billion? And the other is, what would it take to implement a topping off principle with funding just the differential needs of districts? I'm sorry, I'll silence myself.
No, thanks, Jay. And Bill, I see your hand up, but I wanted to actually quote you first from what I heard you say earlier this morning on the air, and my interpretation of it. But you put New Hampshire in the top 20% of states in terms of all-in spending on public education, and in the top 10% of states in terms of performance. So that's a pretty good indicator that we're getting a strong value in terms of performance for what we put into it. So I guess, you know, suggesting that be the cost, as AIR has done, to get that performance level would be a good value, particularly if we could get more of our districts to basically start sharing the state average outcome that so many of our districts have and exceed. And you know, we might not be having this student equity conversation. I know this is really inadequate if all of our students were performing inside one standard deviation of the normal, but or most of it, meaning that we had really sort of a tight, you know, quality, you know, standard Q on the spread, but we don't. We don't have anything close to. We have like a bell curve of performance that's so flat that we've got our largest districts that are performing close to 2 standard deviations off the norm, and it is absolutely square on a workforce economy problem issue for us, and we have to resolve that. You know, for our economy, but also, you know, to do right by students and families too. So, Bill, sorry about that. I had to.
No, I appreciate it. You said it better than I did. So we are all familiar with the Chinese finger trap toy. You know, you pull and you tighten, you can't get your hands out. I think we're there. And the integration that we're running into, Jay, between the adequacy work group and the fiscal policy work group, we're there. They're two sides of this Chinese finger trap toy concept. Jay, if our target is set that we think the predicted total cost of public education should be about $3 billion. If it's $3 billion and that's interpreted as the legislature's view of the cost of adequacy, and then the first and last dollar rule says, okay, $3 billion is the state budget obligation, not the current $1 billion. If that's where this goes, it breaks. It doesn't work. Why? Because the tradition in New England, remember, Massachusetts state budget contribution is 38% of their total spend. If what we're required to do under the first and last dollar construction, which, as you all know, I totally disagree with. I think it's bad policy. I don't think the court has actually said that, because it would be such a radical demand and constraint on legislative power. If what we have to do is have 100% of our total spend be state budget dollars under some very restrictive first and last dollar rule, we're broken. I'm going to say this and you guys are going to hammer me. I'm being animated because I'm trying to put it on the table for attacks by you guys who I trust. We're broken. There's a 0 chance you can get that through the legislature. It would crack the rating agency's view of the state budget. It's basically almost a 180% increase in state spending. It is a total different model. Now, Massachusetts has got a great progressive distribution. They have this mandatory minimum concept that Dick talked about, and they have most of their state's total spend spent by local property taxes, including this mandatory minimum. If the first and last dollar rule allows that, then we can focus, Jay, on 2.9 billion or 3 billion as the total spend target, but we're not gutting New Hampshire and New England's tradition of a very important role for local taxes. And I think that that's what's at stake. In my view, if what people are advocating in the Conval case, for example, or in other cases, is that we should shift from our current largely locally financed public school system to a almost totally state financed system. Number one, I think that's bad policy. Where it's been done elsewhere in the country, like California, it has crushed quality. It has caused California to go from one of the highest spending to the lowest spending. It caused California to go from one of the highest quality public school systems to the local when their court ordered that. And it's and Jesse, our expert, he commented on that in our commission. So to me, I'm putting it on the table. First and last dollar, this one member believes is horrible policy.
All right.
Whether the court said it or not, I don't know, but I think we got to address it.
Yeah.
Bill, I'm glad you put it on the table, and so we're sort of shifting into that discussion right now. I was going to put it on the table, but I'm glad you did, and I think
It's easier for me because I'm more obnoxious than you are.
but more importantly, I think what we accomplish on this commission is also to be able to challenge ideas, and going back to what Bruce has sort of led us through, and we don't necessarily have to avoid challenging things because we believe something. Let's challenge things even if we believe something different. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is and Rick read it during the commission meeting last week, but from Londonderry in 2006, in a paragraph that's buried in the middle of the Supreme Court order, is one sentence that says, whatever the state identifies as comprising constitutional adequacy, it must pay for. None of that financial obligation can be shifted to local school districts, regardless of their relative wealth or need. And while that quote doesn't use the words first and last dollar, and I'm just challenging this. I'm not agreeing either way on this. How can it be interpreted any other way?
You're talking first and last dollar for a constitutional adequate education.
Yep.
But now let's define what is constitutional adequate. What's adequate? What's the opportunity for an adequate education? And there's where we have to really, are you talking about the whole 9 yards?
Yep.
Everything that's in DOE 25 form?
Yep.
Well, obviously there's some things there which are well beyond what.
How do you know that? Don't all those things get you state average outcomes?
In my build-up type process that Bill talked about, I see there's some things offered in school districts, such as sports, that are not necessarily an adequate education. And those costs are in the DOE 25 form. Now, are we going to cover the cost of everything? Or are we going to cover the costs of what is necessary and defined in our statutes as an adequate education?
Okay, so just to be fair, Rick, and you laid it out really well. Just to be fair, we're already covering the costs now, statewide. $1 billion comes from the state, $2 billion comes from local property taxpayers. We're already covering the cost. In fact, the $2 billion voted by local property taxpayers, I mean, unless you're in a city which may do it a little bit differently, that goes before voters. It's defended by school board members, and it's up to the voters to up down on it and take their checkbook out and write the big check. So they don't take that lightly. I know, and so we're already paying for it, and why wouldn't everything that's contained in that be part of what's considered to be, and we're sort of morphing this into an adequacy argument, but why wouldn't that be expected to be contribute to the state average outcome?
I'd be glad to go that direction if the legislature identifies all that you're saying as the necessary components, the criteria for an adequate education. That is where it's up to the legislature to do this defining. And to this point, Dave, we haven't done that.
So you're talking about defining the stuff or defining the criteria for an adequate
knowledge and the core knowledge and principles that contribute to an adequate education. We've attempted to do that within 193E, and it's always been that criteria for a substantive education criteria has been difficult for many to really wade through. But then there's other components elsewhere in our statutes to say you must provide this and that, and I'm sure Jay is working through all those other statutory areas right now. Are those part of an adequate education? If so, why aren't they listed there under those 1 through 10 or 9 components of the criteria? To me, there's a lot of conflicts between where we're going right now and what we have in statute.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of work that's got to be done there. Dick.
Yeah, I think I want to get back, Rick. I think, and everyone, that we need to get to this question of what's the first and last dollar, what it means, and we can get to that by for the moment saying, okay, there's an adequacy amount, and part of that, but not all of that, in this discussion is going to come from what are traditional state taxes, whether they're from the rooms and meals tax or other draws. Sorry about this.
I just got the same call.
Probably polling.
Yep.
Well, it comes from Washington, D.C. I just got it.
No, it's my daughter, and she's calling for my wife, and I guess she's not here. But anyway, and she's wrestling in New York City with school attendance issues, you know, with her little daughters, and so life goes on. So back to an assumed adequacy level, part of which is going to be traditional state money that nobody questions. It's state money, and we've got $601 million of it right now in the system, and then the rest of it. And part of that rest right now is the statewide education property tax. And that's sort of questionable because the excess is allowed to stay with some of the towns. And so that's the picture that our courts have looked at throughout this series of court cases. Some real honest to God state dollars and a lot of local property tax dollars. Unbridled local property taxes, and by that tax money, and by that I mean it's tax money that's raised at the local level with the resources they have at the local level, the property values that they have are what they've got, and they tax that. And in some cases, they've got to go to a very high rate, in some cases to a very low rate, and that's led to litigation. So when we get to the mandatory minimum concept, which Massachusetts uses, we go into a uniform rate for that local contribution. We turn that unevenness into a uniform rate applied against the resources in each town, and expect the towns, demand that the towns assess their taxpayers at that rate. Is essentially the same as our current statewide education property tax, where no excess is claimed by the state. It stays within, and in fact, in a town like Rye or Waterville Valley, the actual rate would begin to go down for those high property value towns. And that system, the Massachusetts courts have embraced. And I have here language that's interesting from the Hancock decision, 2005, where the court was reviewing all the developments that had happened since the original seminal decision in McDuffie in the 1990s. And by that time, the Chapter 70 system in Massachusetts had been enacted and had developed over time a system that depended on this mandatory minimum. And the court in 2005 embraced that system and wrote this. This is in the opinion. The writer says, where before 1993, the legislature ceded to municipalities virtually unlimited control over school budgets. And that's what we've had in the past, where municipalities had to raise the money locally. The Act now requires municipalities to provide a standardized contribution to education. A municipality's required contribution to its foundation budget depends in large part on its equalized property valuations. The Commonwealth provides the difference between municipalities' mandatory funding obligations and their respective foundation budget amounts. So they raise what they can, and then the state comes in behind and provides the rest of it. That's a picture that our court hasn't looked out at. The picture they've looked out at is one where there's state money, there's clearly state money, and the rest has to be raised by the local towns, given what they've got, and it's very uneven. Replacing that with the mandatory minimum would be a system where municipalities would raise a lot of money, but they'd raise it through a uniform rate, and the state's dollars would provide the rest to allow that municipality or that town that's a member of a co-op school district to produce the money that it's supposed to produce to make everything square at this school district spending level. I think it's a good system. I think it's a system that our court has never looked at. And while the language that they've used does lead to many people to conclude that it's got to be all sort of traditional state money, I don't see it that way. And I suspect that the court will not see that way if they see it that way. If they see a proposal to use that mandatory minimum contribution as part of an effort that makes sense overall and that indeed moves the whole system to a good place where it's different from where it is now. And we can talk about what that place is, what that adequacy level is, and maybe indeed, as Jay suggested, it's that 2.94 or whatever it is, $1 billion level, or maybe it's something less than that. I'm not going to take a position on that, but I think if part of that is a mandatory minimum local contribution, there's a very good chance that that will square with our judiciary's view of distinctions between state and local. And one last thing, we do need to tease out how mandatory minimum local contribution works. I think there are questions of how you make the thing work. I haven't been able to figure out exactly how Massachusetts does it. I'm sure it's easy enough to figure out, but we need to, sorry about that, I'm going to shut up. We need to figure that part out too.
So thanks, Dick. And I think we've got some representatives from Massachusetts coming up. I think at our next in 2 weeks fiscal policy. So we'll be able to dig into that a little more. But what I'm hearing Dick suggest in a different context, the New Hampshire courts might issue a different opinion than the one that Rick read the other day, that sentence from Londonderry, whatever the state identifies as comprising constitutional adequacy, it must pay for. That they might have a different opinion, or at least show how it's going to be paid for. And I think the other interesting thing is that those two sentences are sandwiched in between two other sentences that talk about any definition of constitutional adequacy crafted by the political branches must be sufficiently clear to permit a common understanding and allow for an objective determination of costs. And then the sentence after it essentially says the same thing and actually finds House Bill 616, I guess, which was subject to Londonderry, unconstitutional because it doesn't contain a definition of constitutional adequacy. So that appears to be the big thing here. But I think how we go about looking at this first last dollar question, I think is going to have a lot of bearing on what recommendations or policy considerations we might put forward. I see Bill's hand up. Is there anybody else that wants to get in here quickly before Chris? Thanks, Bill.
Oh, I just, I thought what Dick said was really important, and glad that it was stated so clearly. Maybe it could actually be written up in some way so we could have that as one of the kind of perspectives that we don't forget and that we use. I realize, to pick up on your last point and what Rick has kept bringing up, I think we need to do a better job of figuring out, I'm going to use the term crosswalk, though I don't mean it literally, a crosswalk between how we're defining adequacy in the performance, how we AIR defined adequacy in a performance way, and a traditional form of adequacy in the terms that people can understand, what was just called for. So when you think of the components that AIR looked at, they are chosen, those three components are chosen because they stand for other bodies of research that are about adequacy. So we need to kind of spell that out a little. So, no matter how I feel about paying for sports, for example, I know that the research suggests that that sports has a lot to do with kids staying in school long enough to graduate. So, I can see that through line. You don't have to go through too many leaps to be able to identify in broad strokes at a high level, why are those three components actually standing for various kinds of what we traditionally would put in an input-based formula? What do they have to do with academic performance? What do they have to do with attendance and graduation? Attendance is the motivation piece, standing there for motivation for many of the kinds of costs that, some people may think of, well, why is that in there? Well, it's in there because you want kids to graduate from school, and they're not going to graduate from school unless they attend. And that's all about engagement, and it's all about a lot of costs, including the costs of quality faculty, including the costs of professional development, including the costs of retaining staff. All of those things have to do with both performance, attendance, and graduation. And so I think, that's not spelled out anywhere. But while those two things are different ways of looking at, they're not totally divorced. And in this bucket of ancillary materials, I think that we need in order to make sense of for people of why these principles. That's one bucket.
Thank you, Chris. Bill, thanks for.
No, I think Chris stated, I want to second what Dick said. He said it clearly, directly. He put the issue on the table. I agree with him. about the conclusion. I'm not sure. The key issue is the most aggressive first and last dollar language in all the string of Claremont cases is the Londonderry sentences you quoted. However, throughout all of those cases, the court has acknowledged again and again the role of local control and the role of local property taxes or local determined taxes, whatever the base is, being used as part of a financing package for public education endeavor. And so, you know, I believe that that language in Londonderry, which seems so declarative, is inconsistent with many other references that the court has that celebrates the tradition in New Hampshire of local control and local financing. And therefore, I agree with Dick that if this were presented as a consistent, academically sound, integrated school finance system like Massachusetts, that if the court were to strike that type of legislative effort down, the court would be directly in conflict with its repeated statements that they are not the policy setting body, the legislative branches. And so therefore I agree with Dick. And I think that, you know, how the commission addresses this is very, very important, because the commission can send a signal. The court takes notice of these type of things, can send a signal that the commission wasn't trying to skimp on the state's constitutional duty or amend the state's constitutional duty to provide an opportunity for an adequate education away. We're celebrating it and embracing it, but the system of finance that we put in place is a mix of state and local financing that brings the community together to have what we've got, which is New Hampshire on average has one of the highest quality public school systems in the country and one of the highest spending public school systems in the country. And we don't want to mess that up, and neither does the court. And so I agree with Dick. I think let's take the rigid Londonderry 2-sentence construction of the first and last dollar rule, take it on and say, if it's that rigid, that means that the legislature has only one option or two. One is to create a fully state financed public school system that funds it properly, the total cost, or to create some cartoonish minimal level of constitutional adequacy and treat that as the state finance portion so we can still get to a proper mix of local and state financing. That latter one misleads the public horribly, because the public says $37.09 per pupil, we spend $19,000 a pupil. How can that be adequate? Because the word adequate is crazy, because we've backdoored our way into a proper balance of state and local financing. And I'm not, like Dick, I'm not signing off on what the proper state financing level is. Massachusetts is 38%. New Hampshire is 32%. Where New Hampshire should be, I don't know that we need to speak on that, although we could. But I think the key is you can't say that it's got to be 100% state financing, which the most rigid reading of Londonderry's 2 sentences would potentially require. I'm with Dick on his construction that a mandatory local minimum component like Massachusetts, I believe, would ultimately pass muster and fulfill the state's constitutional duty to provide an adequate opportunity for every kid.
So yeah, John, go ahead.
Bill, in what decision does it say that the Supreme Court has celebrated the local property tax as a component to funding the state's adequacy requirement? Where does it say that?
I'll show you in the Claremont 2 decision itself, after it goes on to declare the current system unconstitutional because it has disproportionate and unreasonable burdens for the property poor towns, it goes on to say that we are not saying that there isn't a proper role for local control and local involvement in the funding of a public education system. And the majority, in that opinion, did that because of a very strong dissent by Judge Horton, who said, I'm not here to sit and mandate a state financed public school system. They've also done it in regular cases, like in Londonderry also speaks about not about property taxes per se, but local control in Londonderry. In other cases, they say, we're not saying that there isn't a substantial role for local property tax in a public school finance system.
But in everything you just said, Bill, you didn't connect the property tax to adequacy. There's a difference between suggesting that the property tax has a role in funding education in general. It's a very specific leap you're making to suggest that the Supreme Court has acknowledged the local financial contribution to the state's requirement to provide an adequate education, because it doesn't exist, Bill. It's not in there. It doesn't say that with the specificity that it does say in Londonderry that the state's got to cost the whole thing out and pay for the whole thing.
I think, John, you've put the issue right on the table. I, will not concede the point that you're asserting. That's okay. However, the point you're asserting, if we were to have a holistic view of what it takes to finance an integrated, successful, high-quality public school system everywhere in the state, if you have to, if you just openly say it takes, an average of 19,000 per pupil, and then that necessarily under the Londonderry decision means you got to pay $3 billion out of the state budget, I'm telling you that that's a ridiculous, bad policy result. And maybe the court said it as you're suggesting. I don't think they did, because it would be the only court in the country that's ever said that aggressive a thing, except for California, which, as Jesse told us, went down in quality. So I hear you, John. I'm trying to focus on language that celebrates a tradition of local control, which in New England, as you know, every one of the New England states, most of them right next door, Mass, 38% state finance, Connecticut, 37.8% state finance, New Hampshire, 32, Maine, 38. Under the Londonderry decision, you're saying what would happen is all of those systems would violate the Londonderry first and last dollar rule. And I can't imagine the court said that.
Unless you peg the cost of an adequate education at 38% of performance.
I agree with you, Dave, but I think that is a horrible result too, because as Jay has been talking about, everybody knows what we're spending. The real goal of public policy is to spend the dollars necessary to achieve quality for children in every community, Claremont as well as Hanover. And I think that just doing the mathematical game that an excellent, brilliant MIT graduate like you just did is misleading to the public. It's not 38% we care about. We care about the 100%.
That's why I said it was to challenge the thinking. So, yep. I appreciate that, Bill. Chris.
I don't know why this is even an argument. One of the first puzzlements I had and asked the question early on, I think when we had the lawyers here and got the answer, anything the state defines as state funding is state funding. That was the answer that was given. So, because my question originally, as from a layperson's perspective was, how can my local property taxes be state funding? And they basically said, if the state says it's statewide funding, it's state funding.
You're talking about the state property tax?
Yeah. So if if basically we're going to accept that in this no local control state, that whatever the state says is state funding is state funding, and we're going to accept that as we have, then, you know, it just seems to me that the definition can be applied to anything, any source.
Right, but I don't think the state is claiming that your local property tax is state funding. It's only the state property tax.
Well, yeah, but that's an artifact. I mean, that's just because they called it the statewide property tax.
Right, but it's not mingled with your it's a separate.
Well, I understand that, but then, you know, they can identify, by that logic, another source of funding can be called a statewide funding for education.
If I could, Chris, on that, the key thing is that the legal liability for the state tax is on the taxpayer owed to the state. And that's what GAAP, you know, or generally accepted government accounting principles, different related to GAAP. That's why they treat that as a state revenue. The mandatory minimum that is in Massachusetts that Dick described is not treated as on the books of Massachusetts as a state tax because it's a local, locally administered, and if you fail to pay it, the locals come after you for that. And I think that, you know, ultimately, legally, if you fail to pay the state property tax or the state BPT or the state meals and rooms tax, the state comes after the taxpayer, not the local community. And that's why it's treated as a state revenue on the books of the state.
So Bill, in the example, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Well, so I just want, so Bill, just so I understand this, if, for example, we had 100 taxpayers in Portsmouth who refused to pay their statewide portion of on the tax bill, you're saying that that would be the state's obligation, not the local obligation to collect that money?
I'll look to John Beardmore on this, but when I looked at the statute myself to tie this down, I found it that it wasn't clearly spelled out. That if the local community, saw no power on the state to direct and mandate the local community to enforce the collection of that state property tax. I think that it's vague, but at the end of the day, if the local community, say in Portsmouth, said, state, that's your property tax problem, I'm not, and then there's this issue about proportionality. John has talked about this. It is unclear to me the precise legal authority that would mandate the state, that would somehow mandate the local collector to enforce the collection and remission of the state tax.
You raise an interesting point, Chris, but the the state tax in a state property tax in a sense functions in a similar fashion to the county property tax and the local school property tax. So if, you know, Bill Ardinger has a $100 property tax bill, 25 to the local school, 25 to the state, 25 to the county, 25 to the town, and he mails in a $25 check and says, I'm only paying $25 to the town, to the city of Concord where Bill lives, it's the city's responsibility to fork over $50 to the schools, 25 for the local school, 25 for the state, fork over $25 to Merrimack County, and go chase Bill down for the $75 he owes to the city.
Like everything else, it's a push down.
It is, but it's a super interesting legal question. I don't think that's going to have a bearing on where we. Well, it might actually have a bearing on where we land if we're going to juice the statewide property tax to a couple $2 billion. But it's worked for 20 years this way, and nobody's questioned it that I know of.
John, thanks. And I think that's, you've explained it before in terms of the state treasurer issues a warrant to each municipality for a certain amount of dollars, and it's up to the municipality to send it to the state. Good. I had a question going back to what Dick was talking about, and I want to use the example I think that Bill used from Massachusetts earlier, and Wellesley, Mass, and what else did you pick? Lowell or New Bedford?
It was New Bedford.
New Bedford. And again, we'll get some more definition on the Mass Chap 70, but let's say Massachusetts requires this local mandatory minimum of $5. So New Bedford's residents each pay that $5 per thousand. Wellesley's residents each pay that $5 per thousand. And that leaves some balance that still needs to be raised for estimated cost of education. And based on the property valuations or the property wealth or EVPP in each of those districts, the state kicks in a certain amount of state funds. So in New Bedford, it's let's say a considerable amount of state dollars. Wellesley, considerably fewer state dollars. And then for—
And Dave, I've got a graph of that right on my screen if you want me to put it up.
And just let me just finish my last part of it, and then I think putting up on the screen would be fine. And then, as I understand it, it would still be up to New Bedford and Wellesley to raise whatever the remainder is in, through local property taxes or whatever they want to do to get to their budget. But what if New Bedford doesn't want to? What if they don't want to play ball and they don't want to pay $5 per thousand? They're only willing to pay $4. Does Massachusetts, does the state have some? I guess in this case, a stick to hold back on let's say 20% of the grant that would come from the state?
I mean, I can try, and Dick has also been spending a lot of time focused on this, and he was actually in the DOE as an attorney at some points down in Massachusetts. So, but the answer is it's a mandatory local contribution. The town must hit that mandatory. So New Bedford has to raise it. Importantly, the way Massachusetts computes the mandatory minimum, it's not just based on EVPP or equalized valuation in that community. It's also based on assessments of the income capacity of the community so that the mandatory minimum target is not just a flat rate. And this gets to Dick's point. In order to use this in New Hampshire, we have to understand the details of it. And I agree with that, because it turns out in New Bedford, the mandatory minimum is a smaller number than it is in Wellesley. And that's very—
It's not a flat mandatory minimum.
No, it isn't. It adjusts for both local property tax, and Dick, I hope, corrects me if I'm misstating it, but that's the way I read it on the site.
I'm not going to say much more. It's I think it's 50-50, 50% weighted. 50% relates to equalized valuation and 50% relates to income considerations in terms of figuring out what the bill is at the local level. But exactly how it works, I really don't know. And that's why I think that's why I'm glad that the Massachusetts officials will be talking with us shortly. It's a little bit hard to penetrate. At least I find it hard to penetrate and figure out exactly how they function on this score. And it's really important that we figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, but as far as you guys know, the mandatory minimum is considered a local tax. It's not a state property tax. Is that right?
I honestly don't know. One configuration would be in New Hampshire would be a statewide education tax, which is a uniform rate, maybe modified to include an income characteristic. I don't know. That would then be moderated by by what it produces in a particular locality. So it would relate to the budget. Remember, this is different from our statewide education property tax because it's not going to raise extra money in a particular town. It's going to, rate's going to shave down in towns that produce too much money, given whatever the rate is that's applied. At least that's the way I understand it. So instead of that $5, and I think this is in the AIR formulations, it turns out to be $4 if it's producing too much money in a particular locality, or $3. And that's what we're talking about here. So there's some shaving off.
Right.
And I don't know whether the starting point in Massachusetts is a statewide tax that meets proportionality requirements, then somehow gets factored down for these wealthy, endowed communities, or some other way. And I don't know in the end whether we can really figure it out here in New Hampshire, given constraints we have to deal with around constitutional limits on taxation. I just don't know. Let's figure it out.
Right. So in the
And just Dave, on the Massachusetts budget, as you know, with the Department of Education nationally, the Census Bureau, the required local contribution is 36% of their total spend, all revenues on public education, and that is booked as local property tax revenue. It is not booked as state revenues.
okay.
That's why Massachusetts is spending its state share of the total cost is 38.7%. It doesn't include or treat that minimum local contribution as a state tax.
But again, that's an average. That's all in statewide state funds. Massachusetts 38%. It's not. It varies from district to district.
Absolutely. I mean, the example is in you know the Chapter 70 state grant to New Bedford is $11,382 per pupil. The state grant to Wellesley is $1,864 per pupil.
Right.
That's
So
end
that's
of
as opposed to what New Hampshire's doing right now, which is about $4,200 per student, no matter where
everywhere.
you are.
Exactly right.
Yeah. With just a few minutes before we need to wrap, I just want to check a couple of things with people. So we've sort of had, I think, some discussion on first last dollar. I think there's still some questions on that, but you know, taking into consideration some comments right at the beginning that, hey, we're running out of time. Hey, we need to. Is anybody doing any modeling here? Would people like to see models that would include structure that departs from first last dollar and might have some sort of, you know, graduated state contribution based on property wealth, income wealth, things like that? Are people willing to look at models like that? We don't have to embrace them, not asking, but obviously stuff happens in between these meetings, and at some point I think we'd like to bring some models to you know, for the work group to examine, but we want to, you know, do it in a way that at least adheres to what we all agree we're willing to at least look at and talk about.
Dave, I think there's some earlier, Bill Ardinger spoke to, can we get some agreement on certain principles regarding the costing of and funding of an education, adequate education here? I'd like to see us start moving forward on and narrowing this thing down a little bit. We're running out of time, as you alluded to. Do we all agree, for example, on weighted formulas for needing students? Do we agree that special ed catastrophic aid should be a separate categorical.
So Rick, now you're in the Chinese finger trap.
No, I know I'm there, but I'm trying to save us time. So,
No, I understand, but we can still model things, and model fiscal policy and plug in whatever number you want to use for the statewide cost of inadequate education.
I got that. I'm not worried about the numbers.
Yeah,
I just, principle wise.
Yeah. And Jay obviously had to drop off the line, but that discussion, that's clearly adequacy work group, and it's got to go to the full commission too. But I think we can start to work in parallel with that, as Bill was suggesting, to be able to develop some theory behind what fiscal models, what fiscal policy we may want to be either recommending or putting in policy considerations in our final report, which is the report that's going to be relevant to the governor, the legislators, policymakers going forward, and I think what I'm seeing from the general, from the discussion this morning, is that let's not consider only policies that adhere to an extremely rigid first dollar, last dollar funding constraint. We may want to look at some of those too, but let's consider fiscal models that depart from that. And I think in the spirit of what Dick was saying, if something like that was in fact later adopted by the legislature and inevitably to be considered by the court, that they might look at things differently given a different context.
Yeah, well, just to respond to your question, yes, I encourage modeling. Just be very clear that it's a model and an example and or whatever.
There won't be any, the word recommendation will not be written on it. So. Yeah, because we're clearly going into the part where this is going to get really messy, and we should have a lot of challenges on all of these things. And I'll be the first to admit that I catch bugs on my spreadsheets all the time. So these things happen, but that's why we challenge these things and have to have more people look at them. So anyway, final thoughts as we wrap up part one of another long Tuesday.
Mary did have her hand up earlier. Mary, did you?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mary.
That's okay. I just wanted to make sure that in the models that you're going to be running, that we include the minimum contributions. I don't know exactly what we'll use to figure that out, but I think it's critically important. I like what ARR has done, and I think it has a lot of merit. And I agree with Dick and others that I think the courts have not addressed this kind of a holistic system before. Yeah. We've always separated it out. So thumbs up from me.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mary. Let me lay it out with everybody real quick, but at least a spreadsheet that I've built on this, it draws on the ECM numbers directly from the AIR model. It only looks at the front end of the model. It does not look at the revenue, how to pay for it side. It's completely pushed that to the side. And it lines up, and Rick knows that this is it's a complaint, and I think he and I have both run into it. It lines up all the municipalities alphabetical order so that it's consistent on the AIR spreadsheet, the DRA tax comp spreadsheet, and the model that I'm working with, and it's got enough flexibility in the model to, frankly, model it exactly the way it's currently being done. 3709 plus a little bit here and there, and to lay that out. Or you can do other types of modeling, or you can, and it also includes a provision for a mandatory minimum like Massachusetts, and an EVPP based funding, state funding, state grant. It doesn't factor in income. I don't have that data, but we could certainly incorporate that as the model becomes maybe a little more sophisticated, and based on what we've got. And you can certainly plug in different numbers for the three buckets working with our state property tax, local education property tax, and non-state property tax state revenues. Those are the three buckets. I'm not getting into a revenue argument, revenue fight on this. That'll be down the road in the legislature. But non-property tax state revenues are currently 650 million. Year before it was what, 610 million, 615 million. You plug in whatever number you want there. If you want to set aside, I'll pick a number. You want to set aside 100 million for low moderate income property tax relief program. Take 100 million out of that bucket and see what happens to everything else. Or say you're going to do something else to fund that mechanism. But that's basically what this is doing. And anyway, I'll be working with Bruce and Jordan and Carrie on that. We'll bring some stuff forward. And last words, John.
Dave, did I just hear you say we're not going to get into the revenue argument? We're going to let the legislature argue about that down the line? Are you contemplating we're not going to make funding recommendations?
We may make funding recommendations or funding policy considerations, but I don't think we're going to go down we're not a tax policy commission. I think reviewing our charge, we can certainly model revenues, but I think there's a lot of we've talked about it briefly before, John, and you brought up what about casinos, what about legal weed, and I don't think that those are necessarily areas where we're going to be able to make much headway.
That certainly may be fair. It just seems like we've spent thousands of hours talking about property taxes, and we're spending state dollars to poll on income taxes, yet we're not going to come to a conclusion on fiscal policy. It just seems inconsistent with what we've been doing for the last 9 months.
No, I think and we can come to a conclusion on fiscal policy by basically modeling the size of the state non-property tax revenue bucket. And like I said, currently right now, that's $650 million. It's largely business profits tax, business enterprise tax, and a smattering of other things. If you want that to go up or down, you can do that. The legislature can do that, and the legislature could introduce recommendations that could change that. So. But I think we can certainly do a fiscal policy model that reflects a state share, and see how that works out, whether that's 38% or 32% or some other percent, and understand what it would require in terms of the contribution of those three buckets: state property tax, local property tax, and state non-property tax revenue sources in order to get there. Yeah, anybody final words? Rick, you're not moving.
Oh, I'm just reading a lot of Claremont. So I think I'll hold this for this afternoon for adequacy.
Okay, but I want to put it out there. Is that a fair way to do fiscal modeling, that where we can actually see a state share and a local share and not have to, you know, get into a lot of other things that would have to be hashed out at the legislative level anyway.
Okay with me.
I think if you try, talking state share and local share, well, we're doing that anyway. So I have a problem there. But I do know that if we try to get into the situation where we're going to take it out of gaming, or we're going to take it out of a BET or a business profits tax or a capital gains tax or whatever tax you want to come up with, it's just going to get really hashed over in the House and Senate again. So I think that aspect of our job is best left for a later to do. I think what we need to do is, what do we need to do in order to cost an education? What are we looking at? I think we're driving that road. I don't think I'm totally infatuated with some of the numbers we have, but I think we're going in the right direction.
Anybody else?
Just to John's point, I think, Dave, there is on the table discussions about how the property tax system might be improved itself, like improving the low income, low net worth protections and deferrals for folks to try and mitigate the impact. I think that kind of thing is on the table, right?
Oh, absolutely,
Okay.
And in fact, I emailed Jordan this morning. I had a few more questions for Bruce Canua on that, and also wanting to unearth any prior LSRs that may have been submitted over the last 10 years, in that, dig up the fiscal notes associated with those, and how we go about modeling that. Absolutely, that's a whole separate thing to model. That's not part of the ed funding model, but it's certainly very closely connected to the feasibility of any recommendations. So
Thank you very much.
And might there not be principles related to the fiscal policy that we push toward and get on the table, so that we're taking more of a step toward what the legislature then looks at?
Yep. And that's one of the things that Bruce is going to be leading. In fact, I don't know, when are we going to talk about that, Bruce? We've got some additional meetings that I think we're looking to weave into the calendar, as well as an extended commission meeting where I think we want to take up some of these policy questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Through October, November, we're going to be, it's a wild ride, and everybody's noted our urgency. We're going to need to add some additional deliberation time for the commission. So we'll be sending you that as soon as we can. By next Monday's commission meeting, we'll at least ask you to put placeholders in your calendar for those additional times together.
Okay, good. Busy day ahead. It's so grab a quick lunch. Public engagement at 1, adequacy at 3, and I thank everybody for the time and the discussion this morning. And we'll see you in a little bit. All righty. Take care.